guys, it's Mr. Hefner again, and I'm coming to you today from in front of Portland Head Light in Portland, Maine. In the early part of this country, Maine was just a part of Massachusetts. It wasn't until 1820, as part of the Missouri Compromise, as I'm sure you know, that it became its own state. But I'm coming to you from Maine today because we're going to start our new unit, the New England Renaissance. And this is going to be a shorter unit than the one we did on the American Revolution. But it's going to be a unit that focuses on that period of time when America is sort of in its infancy. So the Revolution was a time of turmoil and then kind of wrapping things up, writing the Articles of Confederation, writing the Constitution, and figuring out just who we're going to be. This is that early part of a nation trying to come of age. And one of the things that you'll see happening again and again in this unit is that unlike the last unit, where most of the writing was for communications, like between John and Abigail, or they were legal documents or speeches given for a purpose, we're going to find in this unit that writers are starting to write things purely for the entertainment value of an audience. Now, that doesn't mean it was easy to make a living at this time. In fact, the publishers set all the terms. There were copyright laws were not like they are today. And so if a writer wrote a short story and a publisher bought it for $20 and it became a best-selling short story, all that writer ever saw was the $20. The publisher made all the money after that. And so it's going to be a very, very difficult time for anybody to make money as a writer. And so the writers who are writing are pretty much doing it because they believe that they have something to say. They want to entertain or they want to communicate an idea. And that's going to change when we get to the Civil War and beyond that. Each one of these units is a different period of history. In each period of history, the literature has certain characteristics that are going to set it apart from the others. So we're going to launch our unit, the New England Renaissance, today, and we'll be doing this for about 2 weeks. So let's just do the introduction to the unit right now. All right. As you can see, the time period for this one starts, it picks up where our last unit ended, and we're going to be focused mostly on things going on in New England. Now, that's the Northeast United States. There's going to be a different culture in that part of the country than there is from the Mid-Atlantic or the Southern states. And a Renaissance is a rebirth, trying to give new ideas to a time period. So we'll take a look at why this area might be called a Renaissance. Our unit essential question is almost like all the others we've had so far. How are the social and political events of this time period? In this case, it's the early 19th century. How are the social and political events of this time period reflected in the literature of the time? But I threw in this one word here too, this word transcendentalism. This is going to be something unique to the New England Renaissance, and we're going to look for this not in all of the writers that we read, but we're going to be looking for this in writers like Thoreau and Emerson, because it's a sub-movement of the time period. I'm not going to explain it right now. We'll have a slide to talk about that a little bit later. As always, you have these timelines to kind of help put the literature in perspective of what was going on at the time. Like always, everything above the timeline, these are literary events, things that are being written at the time. And below the timeline, of course, we have historical events. And it's the stuff below the timeline that you probably remember from your American history class. And so we can figure out exactly where these other things go up here. Here's one, kind of ties back to our last unit when we talked about Thomas Jefferson. You might remember that I said if you go into Monticello, his home, you go into his personal library and it's completely empty, even though we know the man brought thousands of books, thousands of boxes full of books with him to the United States when he returned from being minister to France. It's because Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, began the Library of Congress and started it with his own books as part of the donation. So you can see that America has a true literary beginning here in 1800. Down here, you see some of the other things going on here. Like I said, Thomas Jefferson, 1800, gives his books to the Library of Congress. Here you have the Louisiana Purchase, gigantic chunk of land. And it's because the American Revolution gave encouragement to the French people, who then started their own revolution against their king. It didn't go as well as the American Revolution. The king ended up being beheaded. And in the end, people ended up trading their king for an emperor, and that emperor was Napoleon. Napoleon was fighting wars around Europe. He needed some money, and so he cut a deal and he sold this gigantic chunk, this V-shaped chunk that's pretty much all of the interior of the United States today. He sold this to the United States. So what this really means is there's going to be a feeling of pride. There was often this early belief that one day America would stretch from sea to shining sea, and by filling in this gap, that idea of a manifest destiny is sort of fulfilling itself at this point. You then have the Lewis and Clark expedition, which you've got Meriwether Lewis and William Clark leading an expedition trying to find a water route, a water passage to the Pacific Ocean, but they're also exploring this whole area of the Louisiana Purchase at that time. This affects American attitudes. Where are we in the world? Are we a true country? You have presidential elections going on. The Constitution seems to be working. You have America's next war, the War of 1812. That was the one, if you remember, where the British started stopping American ships at sea, pressing American sailors into service on British warships, and it's kind of like the second American Revolution in this time. That's where we get our national anthem. The Star-Spangled Banner was written just after the bombing of Fort McHenry there, and you have that up at the top here. 1814, Francis Scott Key. It gets published as he watched what happened overnight at that bombing. He wrote only the words, though. He wrote a poem. He did not write a song. I'm sure you know this. The words are actually set to a British song called To Anacreon in Heaven, and it's an old British drinking song. So yeah, the American national anthem is a very patriotic set of words set to an old British drinking song. You have other wars going on, battles and things like that as we go through down here. You have Florida becomes part of the United States in 1819. And so, again, more territory, more land. But look at the pieces you're starting to see up here. We're going to read Thanatopsis. It's a difficult poem about life and death and the meaning of both. And it was written by William Cullen Bryant when he was only 16 years old. And we're not going to be reading Washington Irving, but you might remember the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Washington Irving gets credit along with Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe as being one of the three inventors of the short story. And the short story is an American invention, even though you can read, short stories in other countries today. It was created in America mostly because we didn't have the kind of print presses to do books. And so people read shorter stories that could be published in magazines. The Missouri Compromise, that is going to take new territory. It's going to take Missouri, make it a slave state. And the compromise in that is that this part of Massachusetts, which was called the Maine, breaks off and becomes a new state called Maine. The compromise here is that people who were against expanding slavery at least get to keep a balance of control in the Senate. You guys know every state has 2 senators, and the people in the North were very much afraid of adding Missouri as a slave state and giving 2 more senators to the South. So this keeps the balance in the Senate the same, even though much to the reluctance of people in the North, it allowed for the expansion of slavery, which is why we call it a compromise. Going on here, just trying to hit the highlights here of this one. President Jackson, this was largely affecting the Cherokee, but signed something called the Indian Removal Act. As the country's being settled by people coming from Europe, and more families are having children, and they're having children, literally, it was a law passed to take the Native Americans on the eastern part of the United States and move them out west. It was done on something called the Trail of Tears. I know that you've talked about that in your social studies classes. We've got the first really significant slave rebellion. So maybe we've got, a little hints of what's to come with the Civil War and the issues we've got with slavery. Indian wars are going on at this time. America is really a country kind of struggling through a rough adolescence at this point. Going on here, we'll get some literary things. We're going to be reading Ralph Waldo Emerson, and we're going to be reading Henry David Thoreau. We've got some poets like Longfellow we're going to be reading. You recognize all these names. Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Charles Dickens is British, so we're not going to be reading Charles Dickens in this class, but they put him in there just to show what's going on at the time with literature in the world. And as far as some historical things going on here, you notice it's kind of like same old, same old. New presidents, presidents die, new presidents get elected. We're moving along. The country's growing. Till you get to this thing in 1845. This is going to actually affect us an awful lot in the United States. The potato was a staple of every diet in Ireland. And when the entire potato crop failed in 1845, we're going to get the biggest influx of Irish moving to the United States. America sort of has this tradition that whoever the newest immigrant group is has the hardest time in this country. Native people, people who were born here in this country, have shown a reluctance ever since America, was first formed. Even though their ancestors may have come over, they've always been reluctant about having new immigrants coming in. They distrusted them. And after 1845, we're going to have a huge influx of Irish people coming here, and you're going to have a lot of struggles with people in this country actually even forming political parties that would stop the Irish from coming in. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, that sort of rides on the premise and the things that happened after 1845. Moving along, getting up to almost to the start of the Civil War here, you have some other influential books. Harriet Beecher Stowe, her name was Harriet Beecher. She married Calvin Stowe. Together, both of them were staunch abolitionists. And she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Most people in the North hadn't seen, by this time, they hadn't seen slavery firsthand. And this novel painted such a horrible, dark view of what slavery was like. It was very readable. It became the best-selling book of the day. And there's a story, probably not true. We call those apocryphal stories. But there's a story that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln actually met up with Harriet Beecher Stowe and said to her, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." Now, it probably never happened. But the fact that we sort of had that as a legend shows that we really believe a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe moved people so much that they took up the cause of emancipation and ending slavery. You've got some other stories you'll recognize in this time. Moby Dick, even if you've never read it, which you should, you certainly recognize the title here. We're going to be reading some poetry from Leaves of Grass, which is a whole collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. And we're going to be reading an excerpt from Walden by Henry David Thoreau, one of our transcendentalist writers. I gave you a little sneak about that word earlier. Look at what's going, though, in the historical part. We had the Missouri Compromise, little early 1820 look at how slavery is starting to affect the politics of this country. 1854, we now have something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It repeals the Missouri Compromise and makes new laws about where slave territory can be, where it can't be. And one of the things it does is it allows that in Kansas, people should be able to vote whether or not they want to have slaves or not. So many abolitionists in the North supported the abolition of slavery, getting rid of it, that literally people moved into Kansas because of their political beliefs. People who wanted to end slavery moved there just so they could vote against it. People who were in favor of slavery moved there just so they could vote to protect it. And when both sides realized what was going on, violence broke out. And the anti-slavery people were fighting and killing the slavery people and vice versa. And it's really a civil war within Kansas at this point. You might remember talking about something called Bleeding Kansas when you were in American history class. That's what we're talking about here. And you see that is by 1856, and it's a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. 1857, again, heading towards our next unit, which is going to be the Civil War. Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken into free territory, then back into slave territory, and argued in court that once he was in free territory in a place where slavery was illegal, he wasn't a slave anymore, and so he shouldn't have been taken back. The United States Supreme Court did not find in his favor, probably one of the worst Supreme Court cases ever. And again, it shows us that the Civil War is just around the corner here. All right, what does America look like during this time period between 1800 and 1860? I put a couple notes up here for you. One is this idea of westward expansion, as we talked about. You've got the Missouri Compromise and people settling territories across the country. We're going to move from 13 original states to 25 of them by 1836. So this country is growing very, very quickly. And in the 1800s, just before the Civil War, we have the telegraph invented. Now you can send messages at the speed of light from one city to another. No longer do you have to write a letter and put it in a bag and give it to someone on a horse and ride it there. And so as long as these telegraph wires run from one city to another, we can communicate at the speed of electricity. The railroad's invented, and it's covering the country as quickly as possible. The Transcontinental Railroad was conceived by Abraham Lincoln just before the Civil War, and that's going to be completed during this time. So now you can literally ride a machine all the way from the East Coast to California. Now, one of the things that's going to be popular in this New England Renaissance is this idea of the rise of the common man. So in our unit on the American Revolution, we talked a little bit about, well, actually, we talked a lot about the idea of the Enlightenment. And if you train a brain properly, that's how you become a better person. During the New England Renaissance, instead of just go to college to get an education, there was this idea of bring the colleges to the people. And one of the things that came out, I almost should have these as sub-bullets rather than equal to that one. The public education system in this country was formed. Let's make Americans literate, teach them to read and write and do basic mathematics. The other thing is this thing called the Lyceum movement. And what the Lyceum movement was, today you want a little entertainment, you might get some tickets and go out and see a movie. Back at that time, you would buy some tickets, go to your local opera house, and there would be a college professor giving a lecture or an author giving a lecture. It was the idea of bringing higher order knowledge and learning to the common person. And you would just go and participate, kind of like TED Talks. In a way, the Lyceum movement, I just thought of that. In the way, the Lyceum movement of the early 1800s was really their version of what TED Talks are like today. Now, this bit with these transcendentalists, and that's going to be for us, it's going to be Emerson and it's going to be Thoreau. Transcendentalism is a literary movement that is sort of a resistance or a kind of like a, what do I want to say? It's not so much a resistance as it is a response. Let's call it a response to the ideals of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was there are natural laws in the world, and if we learn how the world works, we can figure it out, right? This is going to be a little push beyond that. And the idea is going to be that there are higher truths than just science. In other words, there are things about nature and the world that are simply beyond our comprehension. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand them. So in transcendentalism, trans means across, right? And the next part of it sort of means, it relates to your spirit. Transcendentalism is going to have at its core this idea that there's a little bit of this natural world in all of us. And the way to purify your spirit, feel better, relax, achieve your highest level is to find that connection that you have to the natural world, to transcend or go beyond the limits of just your body. All right, and there's that word beyond. So nature is going to be important, and transcendentalists are going to spend a lot of time out in the woods just observing, listening, thinking, and philosophizing about what is my role? Who am I? How do I play a part of all this kind of thing? The whole idea, the movement, one of the people who spread it most was Emerson. He had a magazine, and he spread these ideas, and his neighbor was this fellow here, Henry David Thoreau. We're going to study them together later on. Emerson was sort of like the philosopher of transcendentalism, and Thoreau was like the guy who learned from his neighbor and then went out and actually tried to do it firsthand and wrote about, his firsthand experiments. So you might find transcendentalism really fascinating. I've had a lot of students in over the years who get really excited about this. And then the last thing that we're going to really pay a lot of attention to here is this is the unit where we're going to have the rise of the short story. So novels have been published. Books are really expensive. The best books are made in Europe. America is not really binding books yet at this point. But we do have literary magazines. You can write short stories, print them, fold them, stitch them down the back, and sell them for much, much less money. And so the short story is going to become really popular in America and eventually spread to Europe as well. So it is an American literary invention. And as I said earlier, we've got Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, and Nathaniel Hawthorne are the three authors who are usually given credit as being the ones who sort of like invented the short story as a genre. All right, so the kind of writers we're going to have here, we're going to have these transcendentalists like Thoreau and Emerson. We're going to have popular writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Washington Irving. But as I said at the beginning of this whole thing, it's not a time period where you become rich as a writer. Because the copyright laws were such that once something was in print, anybody else could copy it and distribute it. You didn't make money. And there were no royalties. So today, if I write a story or a book or a screenplay, every time that gets, kind of like reinterpreted or reperformed, I make a little more money. But in the old days, it was kind of like you just received one fee for doing it, and then any monies that were made after that went to the publisher, not to you. And so the only reason, the question, why write at this time, the only reason why people would really write is because they felt that they had something important to say and that they wanted to entertain people or make people think or make them take action. So in a way, the writer's purpose at this time period is it's a very sincere purpose. I've had students in class who say, I want to be a writer. Why do you want to be a writer? Because I want to be rich. Well, wanting to be rich isn't going to make you a good writer. Right? There's this old saying that you don't have to find something to say to write. You write because you have something to say. And there's probably some truth both ways. But the simple fact is the writers at this time were genuine. They were writing because they felt that they had to. They were not doing it to make a living. Now, we're not going to look too much at poetry. We have some poets in here, and we've got some different types. Right? The first type is really easy to read. We group these as fireside poets. We call them fireside poets because in the early 1800s, your family sat by the fireside in the living room and you would talk and spend a little time at night before everybody went to bed. You didn't have high school sports. You didn't have video games to play. There was no Netflix and chill. It was fireside and warm. And these were poets who were writing very approachable, easy to memorize poems. And families would read them together for entertainment, so we call them fireside poets. Longfellow was probably the most famous of the fireside poets. Poe's poems were dark, right? But they're still good. We like scary stories, and we're going to be reading The Raven in this class. And then you have Emily Dickinson. And, one of the things I always say is look for the similarities in the literature for each of these units, but Emily's out there. Emily Dickinson, first of all, she only published a handful of poems in her lifetime. She wrote her poems and she just simply kept them. And I think it was the 1950s when we had the first complete collection of Emily Dickinson poetry in publication. So she wrote because she just felt that she needed to, but she didn't even feel a need then to share her poems with the public, except on a few occasions. Her poems are deep. They're very unapproachable, unlike the fireside poets, and people can analyze them and study them and debate them for hours and hours and hours. So we'll take a look at probably just two Emily Dickinson poems. We're not going to spend time with this entire page here, but one of the things about transcendentalists is they left us with these little bits of wisdom, right? And we're going to take a look as we go through the unit. We've got some here on the left from Emerson and some on the right we've got from Thoreau. I took a whole page from your book. You might recognize some of these. We'll get to these later on when we cover those authors. All right. So before you go take any sort of check for understanding for the introduction to this unit, let's go over what the questions will be. I'll give you the answers, and then you should be able to get a perfect when you do that. So first question, many writers of this period wrote why? And you have a whole list there. And the best answer that you have there is B. They felt that their writing would do something. It would inform people. It would entertain people. It would motivate people. They did not do it for money. How about this one? Which of these writers would be expected to write a Gothic work? Now, I just mentioned that. I said this writer's writings are dark. And that ties in with Gothic, and of course that would be Edgar Allan Poe. Most likely in ninth grade, you did an emphasis unit on Edgar Allan Poe. I hope you did anyway. How about this one? The works of the fireside poet. Sometimes they're also called schoolroom poets, but I'm always going to call them fireside poets. Which of these descriptions best characterizes them? Yeah, that would be D. They were very popular. Just like you can listen to lyrics from a catchy song and know the lyrics, these poems were the kinds of poems that were easy to memorize. And people would memorize them, and almost like you sing a song to yourself, people would recite the poems for others. It was just fun to do. All right, now we've got some matchings here. And the first one here, I haven't explained, so let me explain it right now. There's a poem by Emily Dickinson called This Is My Letter to the World. We're going to read that one. And it's ironic because I told you she didn't publish most of her letters. Most of her poems, rather. But she referred to her poems as letters to the world, even though she chose not to publish most of them. So that's going to be C. That's Emily Dickinson. All right, I did tell you number 2. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was the guy who wrote about the philosophy of transcendentalism. His neighbor and student was the guy who went out and actually performed the experiments and tried to live it, and that would be Henry David Thoreau. So that would be E. Number 3. Who stated that people should, quote, get what you can and what you get, hold, 'tis the stone that will turn all your lead to gold. Now, that's really an unfair question. I didn't go through all of those quotes, and I wouldn't ask you to remember this specifically, but that is Ralph Waldo Emerson. And a short story is a brief fictional work, and I gave you 3 authors who were inventors of that, but one of them believed that every short story should have a single effect on the reader. All right, and he's called the master of the single effect because of that. And in his case, most of his stories were to bring horror into the feelings of the writer. So that would be Edgar Allan Poe. That's D. And then the last one supported the transcendental philosophy that things are in the saddle and ride mankind, and that is Emerson again. These questions, I did not write them. They come from our publisher and of our textbook. These will make sense once we've read these writers. I don't know why up front they expect you to remember these little details when we're going to be studying that when we get to the writers later. So just think of this like an introduction. All right, this one should be a little easier. This type of poetry was enjoyed by families, memorized by school children, and of course that would be fireside poetry. Number 2, Henry David Thoreau argued that people can experience God directly through, and again, anytime you see these transcendentalists, all of your experiences are by connecting to nature. So nature would be correct there. The short story was made popular by Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and you could throw Washington Irving in there as well. And then number 4, something was in some ways a reaction to the strict rules of objectivism of the Enlightenment. So I started out with it. In the Enlightenment, the idea was nature has rules and laws, and if we learn them, everything makes sense. But in this period, some of these philosophers are starting to say, no, everything doesn't make sense. Sometimes you just try to connect to nature, and hopefully some metaphysical truth will come to you because you're a part of nature. And so that's going to be Romanticism, which was the European movement that became transcendentalism in this country. So again, not a fair question. We're studying American Lit. We're going to use this word right here, transcendentalism, but all of a sudden the publisher wants you to remember that transcendentalism grew out of a European movement called Romanticism. Right? This will be our focus, not Romanticism. And the last one, we talked about the common man could go out, hear a professor speak or hear an author speak, and that was the Lyceum movement. So Lyceums brought lectures and debates to people around the country. Some quick true and falses. True or false, Emerson and Thoreau's views on human nature was similar to that of Hawthorne and Melville. Unfair question. You haven't read Hawthorne and Melville yet. I don't know who wrote these, but we're going through the program, so I'll explain them. I'll be more fair than this, though, I promise you. No, in this case, you're going to see them writing really different things, all right? So Emerson and Thoreau are going to be writing philosophy. Hawthorne and Melville are going to be writing stories. But this idea of connecting to nature and not being able to understand everything is still going to be similar. So very different in that they're writing stories, they're writing philosophy, but you're going to find that they're both connected through similar views of nature and humankind's role in that. How about number 2? Emerson's credited with developing the modern short story. I keep giving you the names of 3 people. One of them is not Emerson, right? Horace Mann, again, throw Horace Mann in here all of a sudden. I told you that during this time period, we are going to start the American school system. How should you know that was Horace Mann? But it was. Now you know it was Horace Mann. Number 4, the Fireside Poets were named Fireside Poets because families enjoyed listening to the poetry around a fire. Yes, the fireplace in the parlor of your home was the place that the family gathered every night. And the last one, few of Emily Dickinson's poems were published, and that's true. I think it's like 7, actually. I'm doing that from memory, but I think it's only 7. And yet she's got more than 1,000 poems to her credit. A couple more. What was the purpose of a lyceum? And that's the first one, to transmit ideas and culture to common people. According to Coleridge, Emerson, and others, where do you go to grasp these metaphysical truths? Again, it's not college, it's not New York City, it's nature. You take off your shoes and you get out there and you just feel yourself connected to the world. The telegraph, important. It's going to pull the country together, send information at the speed of electricity, as I said, and now all of a sudden they want to know who invented the telegraph. Where does this come from? Whoever wrote this unit needs to be bopped on the head with one of those pool noodles or something. It's easy though. You might be able to figure it out. You know that on a telegraph, the way you send messages is by tapping them out, and that's called Morse code because the guy who invented the code and the telegraph is Samuel Morse. Which poet's work differed from fireside poetry? And that's going to be, her poetry differs from everybody's. Emily Dickinson. Her poetry's out there. You're either going to love Emily Dickinson or you're going to be like, what is with her? All right, but we'll get to her later in the unit. What did Edgar Allan Poe describe as a brief fictional work designed to create in the reader a single dominant impression or, keyword, effect? All right, and that's going to be the short story. He's one of those 3 inventors, and he had his idea of what a short story should do. Transcendentalists. Imagine you're in a discussion. Everything we've talked about so far, you're in a discussion, you've got to pick a topic. Which one of these would a transcendentalist not want to talk about? This is kind of like a higher order thinking question. They loved meditation techniques. They loved discussing the spiritual world. They loved talking about protecting the environment, but they would have couldn't have cared less about financial investments. How about this one? In the context of the following sentence, what does the word subjective mean? All right, now I'll give you a little hint here. We just used the word objective to refer to Enlightenment philosophy. Now we're talking something different. Here's the sentence. The Romantic writers felt that the Enlightenment thinkers placed too much value on objective reality and not enough on subjective experiences. So you can just kind of read into that sentence that, subjective must be the opposite of objective. And if objective is there are laws and they don't change and you just need to learn them, this is going to mean something very different. And it's going to mean things that you cannot just simply perceive with your senses. They're not that clear. You might have to connect spiritually to begin to understand, not just listen. All right, so that is the introduction to the New England Renaissance. It's a different kind of unit, as I said before, because we're going to have the first pieces that are really written in this country for entertainment, not to make a record or to pass a law or to convince people at an assembly. This is going to be the first entertainment literature. And we'll get started with that probably tomorrow. But thanks for staying with me to the end.